Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a historical linguist and specialist in the Old Norse language teaching at the University of Colorado Boulder. On YouTube, I post videos about Norse language and myth pretty frequently, and because I use reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation, I'm often asked how we can know what a dead language like Old Norse sounded like. In this video, I want to share with you a few key points that help us understand the pronunciation of extinct languages as long as there are historical records of them. Languages that are unattested are a little bit more difficult, and the science of reconstructing them is a somewhat different game. Keep in mind that our limitations are maybe fewer than you might think and are mostly confined to the really sort of peripheral edges of how a language might have sounded that probably would make the difference in what a native speaker versus a non-native speaker would sound like. If you think about dialects of English today, most of the differences are really in matters of rhythm and in the pronunciation of vowels, either in exactly where the vowel is in your mouth or in exactly how long or short you hold that vowel sound. So if you compare a speaker from the Rocky Mountains like me with a speaker from Georgia, with a speaker from Massachusetts, with a speaker from southeastern England, with a speaker from northeastern Scotland, you're going to find broadly similar vocabulary and grammar, and the differences are mostly going to be in the small details of rhythm, accent, tone, and the finer points of how vowels are pronounced. Those things aren't necessarily all that reconstructible, except with languages where we have extremely good records. But the broader strokes of how vowels and consonants generally sounded are actually very much within our grasp. So two key points to keep in mind are these, and I'm going to elaborate on them in a moment. Writing systems are very stable and conservative for the most part. And two, language changes in a systematic way. So languages that are related to one another can give us very good systematic information about each other. Okay, so point number one, writing systems are generally stable and conservative. What I mean by that is, if you are a medieval monk and you are trying to come up with a way to write Old Norse and the Roman alphabet for the first time, as must have happened at some point in the 11th or 12th century, you are not going to do it as a cryptogram. You are not going to say, for this language, I'm going to let Z mean the T sound, and R mean the E sound, and B mean the K sound, right? You're going to use the values that those letters have in other established languages that use that alphabet to guide what letters represent what sounds in the new language that you're adapting that alphabet for. So you're not just totally starting off from scratch, and that helps us in deciphering how such a historical language is pronounced. We can look at an M in a historical language like Old Norse and think, unless we see something that suggests otherwise, that's probably an M sound. We can see an O and say, unless something else suggests otherwise, that's probably an O-like sound. Now, if you keep in mind modern languages that use the Roman alphabet, O-like sound can mean a couple different things. An American English O with that oo sound, that's an off glide there. We don't say just one O, we say O in American English if you listen to it slowly. That's not identical to the way that a Mexican Spanish speaker says O, right? And I'm probably not even doing that quite right because I have an American English accent. But if I say the Spanish word cuervo, with my American English O, that's not going to be, totally incomprehensible to a Spanish speaker. They're going to realize that I'm substituting my own close, approximate sound for the sound in their language. And similarly, even though O may not represent exactly the same sound in all the different languages that use the Roman alphabet, it represents something close enough, right? Something that a speaker of one language will hear as a version of the same sound. It's not going to completely misguide you. O isn't going to spell K again, right? It's not going to spell even another vowel like E. It's going to spell something that's in the back of the mouth, roughly mid-height and rounded. Okay, so we're not going to be completely misled by the alphabet, although of course there are going to be sounds in a given language that are not representable by the original alphabet as it was used for the original language the alphabet was designed for. We see this in Old Norse, and in fact this problem was tackled head-on by some Old Norse scholar whose name is totally lost to us. There is a document called the First Grammatical Treatise that survives as an appendix to a copy of Snorri's Prose Edda. And in the First Grammatical Treatise, which is anonymous, but probably dates to about 1140 AD, the writer presents the ways that the Roman alphabet is not quite adequate for writing Old Norse at the time, again, probably around 1140. So what the writer of the First Grammatical Treatise does is set up minimal pairs. This is the same thing we do in modern linguistics to show that in a given language, two vowel sounds are different phonemes. If you can show that two words differ in meaning because only one sound in those two words changes, then you've got a minimal pair. You've proven that those two sounds, the two that are different in those two different words, are two different phonemes. They're meaningfully different sounds in a language. For example, we know that in English, E and I are phonemic different vowel sounds because fight and feet are two different words with two different meanings, right? These are minimal pairs. So the author of the First Grammatical Treatise, in a very scientific, very methodical way, sets up minimal pairs to show what the different vowels of Old Norse are. And in this way, shows that the 5 vowels of the Latin alphabet are not enough to convey the different vowel sounds that are meaningful in Old Norse. This is extremely valuable because not only does it show us that the 5 vowels of the Roman alphabet, A, E, I, O, U, probably can be read as having their normal European values in Old Norse, A, E, O, U, because the First Grammarian doesn't say anything about them being bad matches. But also, the First Grammarian describes the way that the other 4 vowel sounds are made in the mouth in such a way that it actually seems pretty consistent with the pronunciation of the equivalent vowels in modern Scandinavian languages. So for instance, these 4 vowels, just to give you an example of how this sort of thing works, are A, which is represented by A and E written together. That is further forward in the mouth than A, but lower in the mouth than E. There's E, which is further forward in the mouth than O, but still rounded like an O. In fact, in origin, this letter is an O with an E written inside of it. It's rounded like an O, but it's in the front of the mouth like an E. E. Then there's Y, which is pronounced with rounding of the mouth like a U, an U, but in the front of the mouth like an E sound, E. And then there is O, which is rounded like an O, but lower in the mouth like an A. I often use the example of a northern New Jersey pronunciation of coffee. Coffee. I'm not very good at this. So, with the help of the First Grammarian, we can see that there are 9 phonemic vowels in Old Norse, and we can see that the way of writing them, which was adopted by later Old Norse writers and then by modern editors in our editions of Old Norse texts, are we can be pretty confident about how those are pronounced. And then we don't have as much trouble with consonants, partly because consonants don't change as fast as vowels do, but also because the values of consonants in the various different European languages are very stable. So again, you're not going to use L to write a K. L probably means something like an L. So we may not be able to get to exactly the nitty-gritty of an accent in Old Norse. Does it sound more like Icelandic or Norwegian impressionistically? But we can be pretty sure of the basic meaning of the vowels and consonants. And we can be pretty sure that some elements of modern Icelandic pronunciation are late in date. They originate since Old Norse was first written. For instance, the way that modern Icelandic pronounces 2 L's as a TL, so the word for mountain is fjall, but written Fjall. That's almost certainly something that happens in the late medieval or modern period, because in Old Norse, if we were adapting the Roman alphabet to write it, we would probably hear that as Fjatl. It wouldn't make sense to mislead, to mislead someone trying to learn how to write it, but also to complicate someone who's a native speaker of this language, to complicate their road to writing the language. Complications, things like silent letters, things like weird pronunciations of something in a way you wouldn't expect, like LL as TL. These are almost always the results of a very developed, very mature language with a written standard. They're not going to creep in at the very beginning of the writing tradition of a language. Okay, so point number 2 that I made, language changes in a systematic way. So in a language like Old Norse that has modern descendants, the modern Scandinavian languages, we can look at the way that words differ and see systematic patterns. Those systematic patterns, no doubt, reflect systematic facts about Old Norse. So let's take a look at a word in Old Norse and at the same word in the modern Scandinavian languages and see if the way that it's pronounced in the modern Scandinavian languages can help us triangulate and figure out how it might have been pronounced in Old Norse. In Old Norse, the word for dream is spelled D-R-A-U-M-R. In Icelandic, the word is spelled the same way, except with a U between the M and the R, and this is pronounced Troimur, Troimur. In Faroese, it is spelled D-R-E-Y-M-U-R, and it is pronounced Treimur, Treimur. In Norwegian, Nynorsk, this is spelled D-R-A-U-M and pronounced Draum, Draum. In Norwegian Bokmål, it's spelled D-R-O/M and it's pronounced Drum, Drum. It is pronounced the same way in Swedish, but spelled D-R-O to dots M. And then in Danish, it is pronounced Drum, Drum, and it is spelled like it is in Norwegian Bokmål. In Elfdalian, we would expect this to be Drom, Drom, D-R-O-M, but I believe speakers say it like the Swedish word. That may just be later Swedish influence. It's worth mentioning though. All right, so we have some interesting facts here. Let's look at this letter by letter. First of all, the D in the Old Norse word. This is pronounced as a D on the continent, but then Iceland and the Faroes pronounce that D as technically an unaspirated T. This is a very fine difference and a little bit difficult for English speakers to hear the difference between, but it's an open question then, is the Old Norse D an unaspirated T, or is it a voiced D like we hear on the continent or in English? And different scholars have different opinions about this. I would tend to think that probably the continental Scandinavian D with a voicing distinction is older, simply because that's typologically more common in the world's languages. And Occam's razor asks us to look for the commoner things in older languages, just like we look for commoner things in modern, or rather to say that what's common in a modern language is probably common in older languages too, and that unusual features are probably the result of later change. But it could well be that in Old Norse it was a distinction of aspiration between D and T rather than a distinction of voicing between D and T. That still doesn't mean that our reconstruction abilities are really challenged, because we're still in the ballpark. The D is still a sound that a medieval speaker of, say, Latin or German or English would hear as a D, just like modern speakers tend to hear the Icelandic and Faroese D as a D. They don't hear it as an unaspirated T typically. The R is also kind of an interesting challenge because we have a few different sounds there. Icelandic, Swedish, and Norwegian have a tap or trill, R, like in Scots, typically not as long as in Spanish. Faroese has a flap R, like American English, R, right, R. And then Danish, and then some dialects of Swedish and Norwegian have a uvular R. I can say it in a word more easily than on its own. Drøm, drøm. Okay, so which one is Old Norse? Again, you could make an argument for sort of any of these, but the weight of typology of sort of the normal situation of world languages is that an R is typically a trill. So without further evidence leaning one way or the other, it's probably best to assume that it's a trill in Old Norse, although some scholars have argued for it being a uvular R too. It appears that the Germanic languages have originally a trilled R sound, and that the uvular R that you hear in, say, German or Danish is the result of French influence. A picture just fell on another wall. In English, in a dialect like Scottish, which is very conservative in a lot of respects, you do hear that tap or trilled R, and the general conservativeness of Scottish English or Scots suggests that probably is the original sound in English too. So on balance, we think that in early Germanic languages it was a trilled R. Then the vowel in that main syllable. That's pretty tough because we've got a lot of different sounds here. And basically what it comes down to is if you look at AU and you're a speaker of language written with the Roman alphabet, what is the most natural thing for that to represent? And it's probably ow, right? Because we have a plus u, ow, ow. The closest thing to that is the Norwegian pronunciation, and so I would think that that is actually the pronunciation in Old Norse as well. Modern Icelandic then has a fronted version of that sound. That diphthong has gone further forward in the mouth and become ui, but that is not likely to have been the original pronunciation of the diphthong au in Old Norse, because why would someone who had a background in medieval Latin use au to represent a sound ui? You would be more likely to write that using maybe something like ui if you were using just the basic Roman alphabet, or if you were using the modified Old Norse Roman alphabet, you might write that as o/ and then y. That is how the same sound as in modern Icelandic, droimur, is represented in modern Norwegian in words like ui, island. So simply because of the way that the word looks, it is probably most likely that that vowel sound was an ow, like a Norwegian. Then there's the M, that's the same in all these languages, so there's no reason to think that it wasn't a normal M type sound in Old Norse either. But then the R at the end is kind of an interesting challenge. Clearly the R has been lost on the continent. If we look at older documents in very old Norwegian, very old Swedish, we do see that R. So this is something that's been lost on the continent rather than gained in Icelandic and Faroese, which of course you can tell because there's an R in the Old Norse word spelling too. But how is it pronounced? Is there a vowel between the M and the R, or is the R itself the whole syllable? R's can be a whole syllable. In American English we do this all the time. We say water. The second syllable of that word is just an R. There's no vowel between the T, nominally it's spelled as a T, and the R, right? We don't say water, we say water, water, that's a whole syllable. So it's quite possible that Old Norse did the same thing, probably with a trilled R, draumr, draumr. And what's happened is that Icelandic and Faroese have inserted a vowel between the M and the R. We also see that happen in the history of Norwegian and Swedish before the R drops out. We see U's, E's, sometimes A's inserted between the M and the R, or equivalent in other words where R's come after consonants. So most likely that R is simply another syllable, draumr, and then we have something like the pronunciation of the Old Norse word, draumr, which is not identical, notice, to any of these modern languages. Even though Icelandic is spelled most like Old Norse, and its consonants are often almost certainly pretty consistent with Old Norse pronunciation, the vowels appear to have changed quite a bit if we look at just the sort of reasonable guidelines to how you would be adapting the Roman alphabet to a new language in the Middle Ages. One other thing to note about that example word dream and its various manifestations in the different Scandinavian languages. If the sound ui appears in one word in Icelandic, as it does in droimur here, it is going to be reflected by an ow in traditional Norwegian dialects outside of the far eastern part of Norway, and it's going to be reflected by an u in Swedish. So not just droimur, draum, drum. This isn't just an isolated set. There's also a set like the word for I, Icelandic uiga, modern Norwegian auga, Swedish uga, right? These are systematic relationships between the sounds of these languages. Ui in Icelandic is an ow in Norwegian, is an u in Swedish, unless something else has intervened, like a word has been borrowed from another language. So that very systematic relationship shows us that these languages are developing in systematic ways, and if we can project back those systematic changes, we can get closer to Old Norse. A good example of that is in that vowel sound. Notice that in Swedish and Danish, it's a monophthong, it's u. This is written as o/ in Danish and Norwegian, and O with two dots in Swedish. In very early runic inscriptions from the East Scandinavian area, from Sweden to Denmark, we do see a diphthong there. We do see something like this AU in runes. So that shows us that what's happened is that the original diphthong sound of Old Norse that we still see in Old Norse documents from Iceland and Norway, this sound that was probably ow, developed into the Ö of Swedish and Danish. So the older sound is the ow sound. So that's also a very good sign that our reconstruction of the Old Norse sound was good. Speaking of systematic language relationships, another way that we're lucky in Old Norse is that the Old Norse poetic tradition is very strict, especially when it comes to skaldic poetry and what syllables can and have to rhyme with one another or can and have to alliterate with one another. If we pay close attention in skaldic poetry to what syllables alliterate and what syllables rhyme, we get a very clear picture of the fact that only vowels that are written the exact same way rhyme. Only consonants written the exact same way are considered to be in consonant rhyme with one another. So that tells us again that this writing system is evolved very consciously and it doesn't reflect the mergers of sounds that we see in the later Scandinavian languages. For instance, in modern Icelandic, the letter Y and the letter I sound the same. The short version is an I, the long version is an E. So for instance, the word fiskur, fish, has the same vowel sound as the word yfir, which means over. But in skaldic poetry from the Old Norse period, those two vowels can never be considered to rhyme with one another. So we can suspect that this situation was more like on the continent in Norwegian and Swedish, where the vowel was an E written I and an Y rounded written Y. So something more like fiskar and yfir. So that particularly strict system of rhyme and alliteration in skaldic poetry is a real blessing to us in reconstructing Old Norse phonology, although we have to keep in mind that since the language changed from generation to generation, the facts of how skaldic poetry is pronounced in, say, the 800s, because we do have poetry that old, is often a little bit different from how it's pronounced in the 1300s, particularly because some vowel mergers had happened by the later period. But we can see that in the rhymes. So, there are things that work in 800s poems that don't work in 1300s poems, and vice versa. And that also gives us a diachronic view of Old Norse, how it's pronounced differently from generation to generation. This video is a remake of an earlier video that had very poor audio quality, so I hope that this one has done a better job of explaining why linguists are often very confident about the way that we reconstruct the pronunciation of languages that no one speaks anymore. For now, from the beautiful campus of the University of Colorado Boulder, I'm wishing you all the best.